Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Martin Delaney Center for Egyptology. And today we have our second long form video of our book review titled The Ancient Egyptians Refute Afrocentrism by Carlos Iskandar of modern day Arab Republic of Egypt. He's a tour guide and self-proclaimed Egyptologist, and he has written a text that was published this year in January, which claims to refute Afrocentric arguments regarding the African character of ancient Egypt. So again, this is a series for which this is video 2 in terms of long form. There are shorter videos, about 10 minutes, that discuss particular arguments, but there are some arguments that require a longer articulation. And so that's what we do in terms of the long form videos. So again, this is part 2 of the book review, Ancient Egyptians Refute Afrocentrism. And we will be back with more when we return in just a moment. And we are back. And again, this is going to be the second review that we have for the text. I guess the light is making it too bright. We already seen the book cover, but just to let you know that I do have the book, and this is not a hearsay review. And so it is an open and a fair assessment of the text. And, I've given some basic commentary about the text already. So we're just going to jump into the arguments. So this is going to be an approximately an hour and a half, possibly stretching to 2 hours. So below in the description or the first pinned comment on YouTube, it will have the video breakdown in terms of timestamps. So, if you have to come back, you'll know the sections and how this particular course is divided. So that should help you as well when you're coming back to reassess a part of the discussion that has been covered. So I'm just going to share my screen at the moment. So let's do that. Let's do the entire screen. Let's share the audio there. Got it. We're going to make this full screen. So let me just turn the camera off there and we will get started. So hopefully you are able to see this very well. And so we can get started. And again, just to reemphasize, just in case you are just flipping through the videos, this is the second critique. There was a first critique, and each particular video is labeled as such. So this is a critique of section 2, actually. And This is the text again. This is the book cover, and this is the author, Kyrillos Skandar, who is an Egyptian tour guide. And the second section, because the book is broken up into three sections, the second section itself is broken up into three parts, even though the three parts are not labeled. So the three parts that the author labeled, the section of section 2 is ancient Egyptians were not black. And then part 2, the differences between ancient Egypt and the black people of southern kingdoms in Africa. And part 3, the relationship between ancient Egypt and its African neighbors in the South through history. And I believe this is the longest section of the book. So we won't go through all the details. And, so we're only going to highlight some of his major arguments, and then we will respond to those arguments. So if want to really get certain other details, you can always get his book on Amazon. So this is pages 10 through 56, right? So argument 1 from section 2 or part 2 of the book. And so on pages 26 and 39, respectively, he makes the following statements. All these collections of statues and scenes and more all over the museums in the world show how ancient Egyptians looked since the dawn of the Egyptian civilization, therefore the Old Kingdom, before any invasions that happened in later eras. The claims of Hyksos invasions and different kinds of invasions that are repeated by Afrocentrists don't work here. Ancient Egyptians originally were not black, right? Secondly, archaeological evidence of this era is abundant, as we have a lot of scenes and statues and document and demonstrate the difference in style and the skin color between the Egyptians and the people of Kush, and show how ancient Egyptians weren't black or sub-Saharan. So we can see here that his main focus is on dispelling the argument that the ancient Egyptians are black. But as we will see, he only has one type of black in mind, right? And then he talks about that the Egyptians were not sub-Saharan, whatever that means, because depending on who you ask, like them coming from the South in the Sudan. Sometimes Sudan is considered North Africa, sometimes Sudan is not. But that's a different discussion for a different time. But you can see the context and where his orientation is for this particular section and his overall arguments in the text. So argument 2 from section 2. He states on page 39, during the New Kingdom, ancient Egyptians followed the same canon of art that was used since the time of the Old Kingdom. Men were colored in reddish tanned color, while women were colored in pale cream color, which is false here because the reddish is actually a reddish brown color. You'll see that it's a dark red to brown. And so I don't know if he says it in this section, but he says it in another section where the reason that the men are painted this reddish brown and the women a pale cream color is because the women were inside while the men were working outside. So the men have this super rich tan and the women do not, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But we'll keep going. Also, the enemies of Egypt from the regions of Syria, Palestine, the Asiatics, and Libyans were all colored in the same reddish color as ancient Egyptians. The different one was the enemy from the Nubian region, which was colored in black color, which shows and documents that the color of ancient Egyptians were similar to their neighbor in Syria, Palestine, and the Asiatics, and had no similarity to the Southern African people. So you see how he is wording and constructing this argument. So he's only considering he's not using the word pitch, but this is what he means, that that there's a pitch black color and that the Egyptians weren't pitch black and that the ancient Egyptians were actually the same color as the people in Syria, Palestine, in that area. And we're going to show that that is not the case according to the ancient Egyptians themselves, which is why we only deal with primary source material, right? So keep this in mind. So the men and women were different colors, right, according to this particular author, and that the Egyptians were the same color as the Syrians, right? So we'll look at this more deeply in a moment. So now we're going to go to the third argument from section 2 of the text. So for each of the long form videos, I'm only going to pick 3 major arguments out of this section, and that's what I will respond to, right? So lastly, he says on page 56, of course, Egypt had some black people, quote unquote, and the southern kingdoms of Nubia had some people with light skin color, similar to any society nowadays. But the truth is clear through the historical facts and the archaeological evidence. The majority of ancient Egyptians had the same color as the people of Egypt nowadays. No displacement happened to any black population outside of Egypt. The Black Americans in the Black society all over the world have nothing to do with the ancient Egyptians. They have no rights to claim our history and our legacy, which shows that, you know, again, this particular author is not really bright, or intelligent, or a critical thinker. And this is not to dehumanize him, but he makes these contradictory arguments within the same paragraphs, as you see here. So he'll make the concession that there were some black ancient Egyptians, right? But then he'll say that black society and basically black people have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with ancient Egypt. If they had nothing to do with ancient Egypt, there wouldn't have been any black people in Egypt to contribute or take away in any manner, any form possible. So it's which one is it is the question, because he's just, you know, making these emotional responses. He contradicts himself throughout the text, and this is just one of these particular examples, right? So before we get into that, we're going to lay some context, and we're going to continue a discussion from the first long form video that we posted just a couple of weeks ago. And this has to deal with the nature of the population mixing and the like, right? So, um, and so this is especially an argument for a lot of African-centered scholars who I advise that they be more careful when trying to make certain arguments, um, so we don't end up sounding like in a contradictory fashion of the author of this particular text, Carrillos Escandar, right? And so you got to understand that there were some people from Palestine and Levant, from Asia, who did migrate into Egypt during pre-dynastic times. But this does not mean that there was this overwhelming influx of people from the Middle East who just came and invaded and took over and created ancient Egyptian society, without bringing any of its culture, without bringing any of its language and the like, motifs and the like. So this is something that we're going to clarify here in terms of the nature of the migrations, where they settled, and what was the dominant culture that created the ancient Egyptians, and then what were their physical characteristics, right? So, of course, this is Egypt, and when we're talking about Egypt, you know, this is, you know, the what we call Lower Egypt, which is really just the Delta area, and then Upper Egypt is this area here, right? And this is the part that is, of course, closer to Nubia and Taseti, would be, right up in here. Um, and so all of this area is, of course, they swear that there ain't no black people until you cross this border over here to quote unquote Nubia, which didn't exist in ancient times. Uh, but we're going to see, and so from so what they're arguing in this particular text is that the ancient Egyptians, the real ancient Egyptians, quote unquote, in terms of their skin pigmentation, matches and hairstyles and all this matches folks that live in Palestine, right? And and then there's some who will say, well, it was just this evenly mixed society and that they were just all mixed folks, which is false as well. So we're going to continue with our discourse. So one of the texts that I've kind of introduced into this online conscious community is the climate controlled Holocene occupation in the Sahara, motor of Africa's evolution, right? And so I wanted to jump right here to figure three. So what it is talking about is how the greening in the subsequent re-drying of what we call the Sahara, which is Semitic for desert. So in English we'll say the Sahara Desert, but you're saying the desert. But how this drying after the last ice age, and then when the ice began to melt in the northern part of the world, how it took the moisture with it that brought the monsoon rains all the way up as far as North Africa, which started greening the Sahara. And so once it took that moisture away, and that area started drying off again, and it's that same monsoon that floods the Nile River, and but that's another conversation for another time. But the important point here is that there have been archaeological digs, and over the years they've been able to accumulate a lot of data in terms of where were the major population centers along the Nile. And so they came out with these four subsequent maps representing the settlement patterns in different time periods, uh, going back as far as 8,500 BCE or before the Common Era. So that's what you see here on the map. So I'm just going to read what's under the images above. So it says climate controlled occupation in the Eastern Sahara during the main phases of the Holocene. Red dots indicate major occupation areas. White dots indicate isolated settlements in ecological refuges or refuges and episodic transhumanists. Rainfall zones are delimited by best estimate isohyates on the basis of geological, archaeozoological, and archaeobotanical data. During the last glacial maximum and the terminal Pleistocene, that means 20,000 to 8,500 BCE, the Sahara Desert was void of any settlement outside of the Nile Valley. So this is key. So that's what you see on the far left. So note the level of dots. Because of its aridness, it was too dry for people to settle, right? The Sahara Desert was void of any settlement outside of the Nile Valley. Notice that it said the Nile Valley, not along the Nile River. Because if you look at the map on the far left side, which represents the oldest date of the series, you notice there's no large population centers going towards the Delta area. Everything is concentrated in what we would call Upper Egypt and Nubia. This is where these folks were concentrated. And I'm going to continue now. Let me see. The Sahara Desert was void of any settlement outside of the Nile Valley and extended about 400 kilometers further south than it does today. B, with the abrupt arrival of monsoon rains at 8,500 BCE, The hyper-arid desert was replaced by savanna-like environments and swiftly inhabited by prehistoric settlers. So now that the monsoon rains are reaching North Africa, now you see the settlement patterns spread out, and they're going into the Sahara and the Eastern Sahara. So notice that there's really no settlement patterns along the Nile River, because at this point the Nile River doesn't have an ecological advantage than any other area. It's just a river, because there's rains, there's rivers, there's lakes, all of that in the Sahara at this point, right? So we're going to continue. So during the early Holocene human optimum, the southern Sahara and the Nile Valley apparently were too moist and hazardous for appreciable human occupation. So that's why you don't see, because now the Nile River is flooding too much and people can't live in flood areas. So, where the land is higher, but there's still rains and access to water and game and food, that's where the people went. So the Nile River wasn't even a focal point of settlement at this time. So after 7000 BCE, human settlement became well established all over the Eastern Sahara, fostering the development of cattle, pastoralism, and I guess it stops there. So retreating monsoon rains. So now we're going to D, which is this here. So retreating monsoon rains caused the onset of desiccation of the Egyptian Sahara at 5300 BCE. So now we're looking here. So prehistoric populations were forced to the Nile Valley or ecological refuges and forced to exodus into the Sudanese Sahara, where rainfall and surface water were still sufficient. The return of full desert conditions all over Egypt at around 3500 BCE coincided with the initial stages of pharaonic civilization in the Nile Valley. So that's that last map you see here. So we come here to where there was a concentration in Upper Egypt and Nubia of population centers. And then with the arrival of the monsoon rains, it became too dangerous, wet, and moist to live and occupy along the Nile. So all these people and their descendants spread over into the Sahara, in what is now, uh, uh, this is the Eastern Sahara, the part of Egypt and Sudan and Libya, right? So when so this is C here. So it says after 7000 BC, human settlement became well established all over the Eastern Sahara. So you see more settlements and the like here. But now when you get to around 5300 up to 3500 BCE, now because the rains have stopped for the most part in this area, now you start to see settlements of population centers all along the Nile. So those people's descendants have now migrated back towards the river and have placed settlements here. So now, because it's drier, they're floating all the way up even into the delta area. So that's what you see in this map. So this is very important here, because the Sahara becomes a major vehicle and may actually be the origin of the so-called Bantu expansion as well, right? So these, at this time, you have other evidences of the Proto-Egyptians in the Eastern Sahara, and southern and the Sudanese Sahel Sahara, uh, creating the elements that will become long-standing cultural icons and practices in pharaonic Egypt later on after their descendants had migrated, back to the Nile River. And so this is an important text by Catherine A. Bard, um, titled An Introduction to the Archaeology of Ancient Egypt. This is the first edition. The second edition is or if you can see my mouse, you can. That's what is being circled, the middle text. So it says something very interesting in regarding her essay, "The Emergence of the Egyptian State." So, and I have important concepts that are highlighted and bolded in the red. So between Kantar and Rafia, about 250 earlier settlements have been located by the North Sinai expedition of Ben Gurion University, with 80% of ceramics of Egyptian wares dating to Naqada II and III and Dynasty 0. Israeli archaeologists suggest that this evidence represents a commercial network established and controlled by the Egyptians as early as early Bronze Age 1A, and that this network was a major factor in the rise of urban settlements found later in Palestine in early Bronze Age 2. Naomi Peratt's technological study of ceramics from EBA sites in southern Palestine clearly demonstrates that the EBA 1B strata, many of the potter vessels used for preparation, were probably manufactured by Egyptian potters using Egyptian technology, but local Palestinian clays. So this is telling you that they're Egyptians in Palestine. In EB1AB strata, there are also many storage jars made from Nile silt and marl wares, which must have been imported from Egypt. Not only did the Egyptians establish camps and way stations in the southern Sinai, but the ceramic evidence also suggests that they established a highly organized network of settlements in southern Palestine where an Egyptian population was in residence. So you always hear about this so-called back migration, um, which they exaggerate and make it seem like millions of people back migrated into Africa. But they never talk about these African migrations into Palestine. And this is going to be very important, especially for linguists, when we're talking about the development of Semitic languages and the borrowings from the African languages into Semitic, right? So, but this is telling you here in these early Bronze Ages that the Egyptians had made colonies and settlements in the Sinai and Palestine, right? So this is also important when you're talking about, cultural concepts that have, become a staple amongst Semitic speakers in this area, because they borrowed them from the Egyptians who settled there and not only created, urban market centers, but of course they brought their spirituality and religion with them. And this is why you see certain concepts and motifs amongst Semitic speakers that originate amongst the ancient Egyptians, right? And that's a separate show for a separate time. So in another text written by, and I don't even know how to pronounce this correctly, but I'll try. Agnieszka uh, Machzinska, PhD, Lower Egyptian communities and their interactions with Southern Levant in the 4th millennium BCE, right? So thus far, it has been generally accepted that in the Chalcolithic period and in the beginning of the early Bronze I period, the Sinai Peninsula remained under Southern Levantine influences. However, the research by an expedition from Ben Gurion University, so we saw the other text reference them as well, in northern Sinai shows that depending on the period, the status of Sinai vis-a-vis different neighboring territories varied considerably, as suggested by numerous new sites found, pastoral campsites dating from the Chalcolithic to the early Bronze IV periods. Both on Chalcolithic and EB1 sites, Canaanite pottery was accompanied by pre-dynastic Egyptian pottery, while on Chalcolithic sites, the amount of Egyptian pottery was insignificant, talking about in the Sinai Palestine area. So during this Chalcolithic period, we'll get to what that period was. in just a moment. So it's saying that, prior to that, very little of Egyptian pottery and presence, is detectable in the archaeological record. However, on the early Bronx 1 sites, it's sometimes represented as much as 80% of the entire material recovered. In EB1, the character of settlements in the north of Sinai changed as a result of intensified contacts between Egypt and southern Levant. In that period, the economy of the local population largely depended on the activity of the trade route connecting both regions. Egyptian Canaanite trade exchange constituted the raison d'etre, or the raison d'etre, of the early Bronx communities in Sinai, with agriculture being an occupation of secondary importance. So we're seeing the stronghold of the Egyptians setting up and controlling trade and making their presence known uh, or making their presence felt in the archaeological record, even up to 80% in some locations of Egyptian materials. So whether it's that Egyptian that brought it there or they brought the material and made it there, there's many different reasons for what was happening at that time period. So, and this is the important part here on page 208. Originally, and now they're talking about, or she's talking about, how the people from Palestine, Syria, Palestine, Sinai, how these folks are now coming into Egypt, but they're only coming into the tips where the delta is. They're not coming into Upper Egypt. These are not Upper Egyptian sites, Middle Egyptian sites going down to Nubia. This is only concentrated in the delta area, in the delta region. So originally they cultivated their own separate identity, talking about the Semitic speakers who came out of the Levant area and traditions. But over time, talking about EB1B, the strangers, meaning the Asiatics, assimilated with the locals and adopted Lower Egyptian cultural practices. The assimilation process was so powerful that materials dated to phase 2 show no traces indicating the presence of foreign settlers in Buto. And so this is going to be important later on in our conversation when we start talking about this model that I call the matrix cultural model, based off of the matrix linguistic model that we'll see. And we'll see that, the few who came to settle into Egypt, they fully adopted Egyptian language and culture. Right. And as we can see, going back to our settlement patterns here, before 8,500 BCE, there's no concentration, there's no major centers. Not to say there was absolutely nobody, but it was rarely occupied at this point. Only towards the beginnings of pharaonic Egypt is the delta now occupied. And it's occupied because the developing culture comes from the south, and these people migrate further up into the delta region. And it's these people who encounter trying to make trade through this corridor here, the Sinai Peninsula, with the people in Palestine. And some of those Palestinians come and settle in the Delta area, but they don't come and establish hegemony here. They fully adopt and integrate into Egyptian culture, as the archaeological record has shown via these two texts. So when you're talking about this period, when you're talking about the Bronze Age, you're talking about 3,500 BCE all the way to around, let's just say, 1300, to 1200 BCE, right? So you have the early Bronze Age, the intermediate Bronze Age, late Bronze Age. Right. So when they talk about these EB1A, EB1B, this is still Old Kingdom. So from the in the fourth millennium, this is, when you start counting in those 3000s BCEs, in this here, in the pro-dynastic time, that's when some of these people coming out of the Near East was settling in Upper Egypt, but they are adopting Egyptian culture. Well, they lose their culture and language at this particular time. But these folks are not settling in the middle, in the Nile Valley, I should say. So that strip of river going all the way to the south, they're not settling in. That's where the bulk of the ancient Egyptians are, right? So we continue, because this is important to say, because they keep having these conversations as if, Africans aren't migrating into these areas as well during pharaonic times and later, right? So this is from an article, HLL Genes and Macedonians and the Sub-Saharan Origin of the Greeks, right? Which was published in 2002. So it says genetic distances, neighbor joining dendrograms, and correspondence analysis have been performed. The following conclusions have been reached. One, Macedonians belong to the older Mediterranean substratum, like Iberians, including Basque, North Africans, Italians, French, Cretans, Jews, Lebanese, Turks, Anatolians, Armenians, and Iranians. Which means that the original Macedonians, are not Indo-European folks. So the Greek belongs to Indo-European. Those folks move in on an already established people who look more like your average Armenians and all that other kind of stuff, right? However, the Macedonians are not related with geographically close Greeks who do not belong to the older Mediterranean substratum, as I just said. 3, Greeks are found to have a substantial relatedness to sub-Saharan Ethiopian people, which separate them from other Mediterranean groups. How can this be the case? And this is important because we're supposed to assume that these quote unquote sub-Saharan Ethiopian Sudanese folks skipped over Egypt and just landed in Greece and Macedonia and intermingled with the local population there without going through Egypt, right? Which makes no sense. So it continues. Both Greeks and Ethiopians share quasi-specific DRB1 alleles, such as those numbers which you see there. And thus, genetic distances are closer between Greeks and Ethiopian sub-Saharan groups than to any other Mediterranean group. And finally, Greeks cluster with Ethiopian sub-Saharans in both neighbor joining dendrograms and correspondence analysis, right? Which helps to possibly explain why you see a lot of curly hair amongst Greeks, right? Versus their other Indo-European counterparts, right? Because they're coming into a mixed situation, right? Which includes quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa. So lastly, the time period when these relationships might have occurred was ancient but uncertain and might be related to the displacement of Egyptian Ethiopian people living in pharaonic Egypt. Now, what's interesting is this was actually, or at least an incident of this was actually mentioned by Herodotus, right? In his Histories, Book 6, Section 55. He states, how it happened that Egyptians came to Peloponnese and what they did to make themselves kings in that part of Greece has been chronicled by other writers. I will add nothing, therefore, but proceed to mention some points which no one else has touched upon. So we have the genetic evidence of this African presence, and then you have written textual confirmation coming from the likes of Herodotus and others. And what's interesting is that, because of course we'll have to do another separate video reminding folks of how the Greeks saw the Egyptians in terms of their phenotype. Um, but it confirms here that, this is an Ethio sub-Saharan type, which is the Egyptians that came into this particular area, right? So now we're going to go into the import of Asiatics. So in the last one, we talked about how there was invasions of Asiatics coming into Egypt. And so now we're going to talk about some important imports of volunteers coming, not necessarily to volunteers, but outsourcing. So the ancient Egyptians, in many respects, probably invented outsourcing, right? Especially when it comes to the textile industry, and this helps to articulate why there's a lot of Asiatic DNA in Egypt, in modern Egyptian populations, right? And so we're setting the context here for our particular argument. And this is stuff has been said by Afrocentric scholars since Cheikh Anta Diop in the 1950s. So, of course, these modern YouTubers and Facebookers don't read, so they don't know what actual Afrocentric scholarship is and arguments. And so you have to, keep reminding the lay public so that they do not get confused by the unintelligent banter from the unlearned who want to make these arguments against, Africans discussing their own history, right? So a book that I often cite from is from Bloomberg, Egyptology, Asiatics in Middle Kingdom Egypt, Perceptions and Reality by Phyllis Soretta, right? And so uh, I'll read this. It says, the probable Theban provenance of the Brooklyn papyrus may be evidence that the Asiatics, who were generally settled in the north, meaning the Delta region, so that was a high concentration area of Asiatic folks since early Pharaonic times, particularly in the area of the Delta, as shown by excavations at Tel El Daba, had become assimilated enough into the Egyptian populace to be working in the south. So this is now in the Middle Kingdom. So now they've assimilated so much into the Egyptian culture that they was able to travel south and do work in the middle and upper Egypt, right? And so remember, upper Egypt is the south and lower Egypt is the north, where the delta is. The presence of two female Asiatic weavers is also attested at Kahun. So Middle Egypt is represented in this group as well. Barber, in her study of textiles, notes that in early societies, the making of textiles was predominantly a female occupation, unlike Ghana, where the textiles is mainly a male occupation. Um, since it is an occupation which can be carried out concurrently with childcare. She also points out that in Egypt, the labor force for textile manufacture is almost exclusively female until the 18th dynasty. Thus, it is not surprising that Asiatic female servants would be placed in an occupation typical of quote unquote women's work. But perhaps there was another reason. It is feasible that the Asiatic weavers were brought to Egypt for this purpose, since so many of the Asiatic women were utilized as weavers. Perhaps they were considered to be cheap labor or that their weaving was of a special nature. It is possible that the Western Asiatic immigrants now in Egypt were employed in tasks requiring special skills, perhaps various skills reflecting professions in which they were engaged in their Mesopotamian or Canaanite homes, in this case as weavers. As a matter of fact, the making of textiles is an industry, well, okay, I'll just stop there. So it's telling you there that in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia and in Levant, They were the experts at textiles. And so the ancient Egyptians um, invited those individuals in to do textiles, to create textiles for trade in, back in the Middle East and of course in Africa, right? And so this accounts for a lot of, again, Syrian, Palestinian, Arabic, pre-Arabic, and other, even as far as ancient Sumer, right? Some of that when once it was taken over by Semitic speakers, in terms of what they now call Babylonian, Babylonian women. And so this is why, like, uh, for example, Jews, modern day Jews, kind of run textile. They've been, that's been a focal point of trade since Pharaonic times in that area. They become masters at weaving textiles and the like. That's why those areas that, you get all the rugs and, the garments and stuff from there. It's kind of concentrated in two areas in terms of major areas. It's going to be northern India, and it's going to be in the quote unquote Middle East. So it's kind of an arch in those areas, right? So this is a painting of weavers from the tomb of Hotep II at Beni Hassan. So, we're saying all of this, we're putting all of this into perspective so that you can understand the mixing that is going on with the native, rich brown black African population, throughout Egyptian times, and how this can change the phenotype over 3,000 years. Keep in mind, Pharaonic Egypt existed for over 3,000 years. So a lot happens in this part. So you have, um, your native populations from the Green Sahara, your Nilotic folks, your Beha, your Afar, your Dinka, Nur, other groups, folks that are related to folks in Chad, et cetera, that make up the bulk of the original Egyptian population, the Remech. And then the later imports, either through war, in terms of captives, in terms of invasions, and them settling later on, or because of trade and needing to outsource certain skills. You're starting to see an influx of Asiatics who are coming from various areas in terms of Amorites, Syrians, Palestinians, etc., Arabs, Babylonians, the whole nine. And then, of course, later on, the Greeks, Romans, the Turks. And so all of this genetic material is left in the present population, right? So continuing on this Asiatic, control of the textiles and how they're being used in ancient Egypt. In this text, Egyptian Textiles by Rosalind Hall, she states on page 18, the Annals of Thutmose III report that Syrian captives were cloth makers on the estate of Amun at Karnak, possibly instructing the Egyptians in the Asiatic art of tapestry weaving. The same pharaoh presented 150 Asiatic weavers to one official. Imagine that. You go into war and you capture a group of Syrians, and then you out of an unknown total, 150 of them was presented to a high official, right? So over time this changes the physical representation of the people, in Egypt over time. And lastly, we want to, because we talked about Babylonia and Sumer. And so The Asiatics and Middle Kingdom continues to state that Lagash weavers are known from pre-Sargonic and Third texts. Lagash remained an important center of the woolen textile industry throughout the latter half of the third millennium. And III text lists female weavers in the district of Lagash. Female weavers and their children produced large quantities of cloth in the workshops of Lagash, which played a key role in both local economies and long distance trade. Sapar was also a center of the wool industry. Large groups of weavers were employed by the palace, right? And so this is Lagash over here in Sumer, right? So it goes as far, the ancient Egyptians went as far as Sumer to get these female weavers and to import them into the society so that they can make garments and even teach locals at this point. And so this brings up a very important question. And so now when you're talking about, what is an Egyptian, it is very complex because you have the original folks, the original population of Ramech who dominated and set the pattern for ancient Egyptian civilization. And then you have later migrants, immigrants who came and settled and who intermingled with the local population and whose descendants grew up in the state and who were ancient Egyptians by citizenship in terms of those who just settled. But then, of course, you have those who, by biology, have mixed ancestry. So now this concept of an ancient Egyptian is a bit more complex, and you can't concentrate it in terms of a particular racial type because the history is telling us, because of the relationship between trade and wars and things, that uh, this is a very mixed society, and it's looking like how the U.S. is starting to look now, especially like when you go to places like Louisiana and California. Right, just look at the NBA now. Right, all those was dominated by white folks, and then they start letting black people play, and then black people dominated. But then those black basketball players, a lot of them had you white and Asian wives, and now their kids are coming up, making it to the NBA, and you're starting to see these mixed children, come in and starting to dominate into the NBA, right? So it's and this is just throughout human history. This is just the way that humans are. So there's so-called racial, mixing and all this other kind of stuff. So like this pseudo-scientific concept of race and the way that we try to articulate it today really has no standing once you put it under scrutiny. But there's a particular conversation that can be had, which must be handled delicately so that we can get to the historical truths that will be able to reveal the underlying secrets of ancient Egyptian society, culture, and psychology, right? So now we're going to talk about this, what the matrix cultural model, right? And so I take my modification of it from Garrett J. Dimmendahl, who wrote the text, which was published in 2011, Historical Linguistics and Comparative Study of African Languages. And in it, he mentions the following, talking about, matrix languages in a bilingual code switching context, right? So code switching in an African context has been described in a number of monographs by Myers-Scotton. And according to this author, participating languages in a code switching situation never participate equally. For Myers-Scotton or Scoton, code switching is the selection by bilinguals or multilinguals of forms from an embedded language in utterances of a matrix language during the same conversation. So if any of you ever heard like Spanglish right? You have native Spanish speakers who will interject English words and phrasing in the Spanish that they speak. But the Spanish is the matrix language, which has the embedded English parts of it. So it's the Spanish that dominates in terms of grammar and the like and syntax, and any borrowings from the embedded language like English, where we get the Spanglish uh, phrase from, is minor, but it makes a contribution, right? So phrased differently, there is always a matrix language structuring the morphosyntax of an utterance, improving a frame for the embedded language constituent. The example from Swahili above illustrated this principle. Bilingual or multilingual speech, accordingly, is characterized by the asymmetrical or unequal participation or contribution of languages. This morphosyntactic dominance of one language in a frame has been formulated into a general property of code switching by Myers-Scotton and has come to be known as the matrix language principle. The so-called matrix language is identified by the morpheme order in the source for the system morphemes, therefore functional morphemes, providing a morphosyntactic structure. And we can really just kind of stop there, right? And so when we're talking about this matrix language principle, we're talking about a core concept in the matrix language frame, the MLF model, which posits that in code switching situations, just how like Black folks code switch at their jobs, one language, the matrix language, provides the grammatical framework for the entire bilingual clause, while the other language, the embedded language, inserts elements into it, as we stated before. So there's three fundamental principles of the MLF model. So the matrix language principle, one language provides the grammatical frame of the clause. Two, asymmetry principle. There is a fundamental asymmetry between the participating languages, with one language dominating the structure. And then three, uniform structure principle. The matrix language ensures a uniform structure across the bilingual clause. And so what I'm saying here is that culture works in the same way, that there's a matrix culture that sets the frame, sets the value set, sets the language, sets the rituals and things of that nature. And it governs in embedded cultures, like in the sense of the Asiatic cultures that came to settle down in Egypt. But as the archaeological record shows, that they may the first settlers may keep certain aspects or keep their culture alive, but over time, in a second and third generation, they have totally, for the most part, been engulfed by the matrix culture, right? But every now and then you will see, parts of the embedded culture spring its head out in the larger matrix cultures, artifacts, language is where we get borrowings from. So we get linguistic borrowings into the Egyptian language coming out of Semitic and Indo-European. We have certain deities, certain motifs that come out of the Middle East that now become a part of the Egyptian landscape as a result of those Asiatic settlers who became part of the Egyptian culture and population, right? And to kind of give you example of an a matrix culture, an embedded culture situation, is the case of hip hop culture, which is an African American cultural expression, which other ethnic groups and people have been able to participate, who have and who have brought in their cultural elements when expressing it. But it's even when they have their particular cultural elements, it's still embedded and structured by the African American matrix system that created the hip hop culture in the first place, right? And this is expressed even in this clip that I'm about to show is it's a small clip. It's coming from the film Wild Style. So for a lot of you old heads, you remember the Beat Streets, Wild Style, etc. You know, early hip hop movies from the 80s. And there's a scene in Wild Style where the Cold Crush brothers are performing. And in around 1 minute and 33 seconds of this clip, you could find this on YouTube. If you can see the image right here on the right hand side, you see this Puerto Rican brother here, right? And his name is Ruby D. And he says the following lines that you see on the right here, but I'll play it first and we'll come back to it.
Listen, yo, I'm not gonna finish. You can't deny better beat down the rock as I am, 'cause I got a Ruby D, my brother, my man. Just get on the mic and take the man.
Well, Ruby D is my name, and I'm a Puerto Rican. You might think I'm black by the way I'm speaking. I'm slick, I'm happy with a lot of girls. That's the reason I attract all the street fly girl.
Listen, yo, I'm not.
So if we go back, I'm sorry. You know, he states in the rap, Ruby D's my name and I'm Puerto Rican. You may think I'm black by the way I'm speaking. Now, why would he say that in his rhyme? Because hip hop is an African American cultural product. And in order to do hip hop, you have to speak in a way that African American jive speak. It sets the matrix, it sets the framework for how the rhymes are said. So for somebody who was to hear him speak but couldn't see his face, what he's saying is that, you know, you may think I'm black because of the way I'm speaking, meaning that you can speak in a black way. So black in this case is synonymous with African American culture, right? So this is important for understanding in terms of hip hop, whose culture dominates, even though other people can be involved and they bring their own element. It's the African American culture that sets the standard, that sets the framework for what defines hip hop culture. And so even in this context, this Puerto Rican has to tell people that he's Puerto Rican, because otherwise you would think he was black. You see him kind of with a Afro style. He's dressing, in African American fashion, right? He's doing rap and hip hop. He's breakdancing. He's doing all the black things, but he has to remind you he's Puerto Rican and not black, right? So now we can see another example of this even in ancient Egyptian times. So what we have here is a quote unquote composite deity, is a stela that was cited that I got this picture from Sally Ann Ashton's text, Roman Egyptomania, right? And we'll see a cover of that later on. But here is, this is from the 3rd century AD, prominence in Egypt of a particular Roman person now looking, how should I say, embedding themselves in ancient Egyptian culture, depicting themselves in Egyptian motifs, right? And you can see, you know, of course, by this time, the Romans and the Greeks, well, the Greeks first, and then the Romans take over ancient Egypt. And each time that they take over ancient Egypt, they bring a little bit of their culture in it, but the dominant culture that remains in terms of the motifs, in terms of the rituals, even the language. Greek isn't the language of Egypt when the Greeks took over. Latin was not the language of Egypt when the Romans took over. Egyptian Coptic was the language. And the culture was still very much Pharaonic Egyptian culture, because that was the dominant culture. That's the framework. But every now and then you will see the Greeks and the Romans insert themselves in Egyptian motifs. And this is exactly what happens with the Asiatics in the earlier periods. Even though their culture and history lies in the Middle East and Mesopotamia, when they come into Egypt, just like the Greeks and just like the Romans and the Turks later after them, they adopt the African motifs, the African language, African wig styles, and the like, right? And all of this is deep sub-Saharan African culture motifs, language, attitude, spiritual systems, and the like. And even in this video clip, this short clip that I'm about to show now, is talking about Queen Nefertiti. And this is Dr. Joanne Fletcher, who did a documentary film, you know, alleging to find the mummy of Queen Nefertiti, right? But she is an expert on Egyptian wig making and Egyptian wigs in general. And so she says something very profound in the clip that I'm about to show you. So listen up.
Dr. Joanne Fletcher. She's an expert in a rare field, ancient Egyptian hair. "13 years ago, buried among the treasures of the Cairo Museum, Joanne noticed an ancient wig.
With certain specializations, you do zoom in to quite a close range level. You tend to see things that otherwise tend to get dismissed as trivial. I'm actually drawn to things which other people may have missed.
A wig is like a fingerprint, leading to the time it was made and who it was made for.
What we're actually looking at here is basically the Nubian wig, the Nubian hairstyle, which generally was only worn by royal women between around 1400 and 1300 BC.
Pictorial evidence shows Nefertiti wearing a wig exactly like this one.
So you heard from her that Nefertiti was wearing the Nubian royal wig. Now keep in mind the map that we showed earlier dealing with the Sahara and how that concentration from Upper Egypt and quote unquote Nubia or Upper Sudan, how these folks set the matrix culture for the ancient Egyptians, right? This is the point that we're getting at here, and this is reinforced by Christopher Ehret, Dr. Christopher Ehret, in his article, "The African Sources of Egyptian Culture and Language," right, from this text here. And in it, he says, in certain other key areas of culture, dynastic Egypt may owe a good deal to its Nilo-Saharan neighbors. Nilo-Saharan is a proposed language family coming out of the Joseph Greenberg School of Linguistics. In particular, the comparative cultural evidence best fits with the hypothesis of a southerly source for the ideology of Egyptian kingship, and unquestionably the Nilo-Saharans, who, along with the Egyptians, form the Middle Nile cultural area, were Africans, therefore black people by the definition of anyone whatsoever. So ancient Egypt was both in and of Africa. It owed some items of culture to the ancient Middle East, but its most fundamental cultural roots stretch back into the African continent. So as you can see, you know, I'm adding these photos of these folks so nobody can say that we are trying to blackwash the information, because these aren't Afrocentric scholars by any stretch of the imagination. Right? This is the standard now, you know, in terms of the understanding and interpretation of ancient Egyptian culture. This stuff you can't find in the Middle East. This is all quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa. And he states this verbatim. What emerges most strongly from the linguistic and comparative culture evidence is the extent to which ancient Egypt's culture grew from what? Sub-Saharan African roots. Remember his argument that in terms of Kyrillos Iskandar's argument that ancient Egypt had nothing to do with sub-Saharan Africa? The entire culture, the framework, the matrix framework of the whole existence of ancient Egypt comes out of sub-Saharan African roots. In the earlier formative eras of the culture that was to evolve into that of dynastic Egypt, it was people from the south, from a region encompassed by, in very approximate terms, Eritrea and the southern Red Sea hills, who moved north into Egypt and brought in the primary features of a new economy and culture, along with an Afrasian language or Afroasiatic. The people of the southerly regions were most certainly Africans, that is, Black people, even under the selective definitions of modern day holders of anti-Afrocentrist views, meaning that even, if you have anti-Afrocentric views, by every stretch of the imagination, you would have to argue that these were Black African people, right? 19th and 20 and earlier 20th century writers. So he's telling you, using the exact word sub-Saharan, is that this is where the people and the culture comes from. Culture just doesn't appear out of nowhere. People bring culture. Others can adopt culture, but it comes from a people. It comes from a source. And those people have phenotypes. They have language. They have a culture. They have a psychology. There's many things that identify a group of people, right? And so, for example, even the very name of the Egyptians themselves, when they call themselves the Remet, or even the very word Remet itself, which means a person, a human, an individual, a man, right? You find this all over Africa. So in the photo that you see here is a representation of some either Nuer or Dinka men, and they still exist to this day. They still have the red hair. You can see that the ancient Egyptians even depicted correctly the slope on the forehead, which you could see right here on these individuals. And these are very dark-skinned individuals, and they still to this day wear the leopard skin aprons, just like how they were recorded in pharaonic times, right? So this begs the question, if the ancient Egyptians are capable of accurately portraying their neighbors, by what stretch of the imagination are we to argue that they are incapable of then representing themselves accurately? And that's the question that you have to ask yourself, right? So here's the word remech without the ch suffix in all of these different African area or language spaces, right? So in there is Ram, Dinka's Ran, Dinka Lan, in the Beja language, Raba, Oromo, Somali Lab, in Chiluba, Muleme, other Bantu languages, Mulumi, Nlumi, in Dogon, Nomo, Dime, Reme, in Ivory Coast and Ghana. Like the very name that the ancient Egyptians called themselves, you can find it in all of these quote unquote sub-Saharan African languages, but you can't find them in Indo-European, and you can't find them in Semitic languages or Berber. So how does a people who allegedly comes from the Middle East, according to Iskandar and others, identify themselves with a name that they don't even have in their languages, but exist in the languages all across sub-Saharan Africa? Makes no sense whatsoever. So this is from the article Egypt. Well, it's from the book Egypt in its African Context. The article is by the late Dr. Alain Anselin. Some notes about an early pool of cultures from which emerged the Egyptian civilization. So he notes the following. It is possible from the overview of the data to conclude that the limited conceptual vocabulary shared by the ancestors of contemporary Chadic speakers, therefore also contemporary Cushitic speakers, contemporary Nilotic speakers, and ancient Egyptian speakers suggests that the earliest speakers of Egyptian language could be located to the south of Upper Egypt or earlier in the Sahara. Didn't we just see the other study which made that same argument? Where Takacs suggests their long coexistence can be found. In addition, it is consistent with this view to suggest that the northern border of their homeland was further than the Wadi Hawar proposed by Blinch, 1999-2001, which is actually its southern border. Neither Chadics nor Kushitics existed at this time, but their ancestors lived in a homeland further north than the peripheral countries that they inhabited thereafter. To the southwest in a Niger-Congo environment, and to the southeast in a Nilo-Saharan environment, where they interacted and innovated in terms of language. From this perspective, the Upper Egyptian cultures were an ancient Northeast African periphery at the crossroads, as suggested by Dahl and Hajort Afwarnas of the Beja, and that's the text he's referencing. The most likely scenario could be this. Some of these Saharo-Nubian populations spread southwards to Wadi Hawar, Inedi, and Darfur. Some stayed in the actual oases where they joined the inhabitants, and others moved towards the Nile. Because now we're talking about the desiccation of the Sahara after the last glacial period in terms of its melting and taking the moisture out of North Africa. Directed by two geographic obstacles, the Western Great Sand Sea and a Southern Rock Belt, their slow perambulations led them from the area of Sprinkle Mountain to the east, Bur Sahara, Nabta Playa, Gebel, Ramla, and Nekin, Hyrcanopolis, Upper Egypt, into the northeast by way of Dakhla Oasis to Abydos, Middle Egypt, right? And so we have this other text here, Cranial Discrete Traits in the Byzantine Population and Eastern Mediterranean Population Movements by F.X. Ricault and M. Watkins, right? And in this text, it says the following. From the Mesolithic to the early Neolithic period, different lines of evidence support an out-of-Africa Mesolithic migration to the Levant by northeastern African groups that had biological affinities with sub-Saharan populations. From a genetic point of view, several recent genetic studies have shown that sub-Saharan genetic lineages affiliated with the Y chromosome P and 2 clade have spread through Egypt into the Near East, the Mediterranean area, and for some lineages as far north as Turkey. Probably during several dispersal episodes since the Mesolithic, and then his citations there. So if you don't understand, the Mesolithic is 10,000 to 8,000 BCE, and the Neolithic is 8,000 to 3,000 BCE. So from 10,000 BCE to the start of Pharaonic Egypt, sub-Saharan Africans have been migrating out of quote-unquote sub-Saharan Africa and into the Levant and settling and mixing with those populations there, which would also account for, besides natural suntan, why some of those people are darker than others in that area. While like some in terms of like in southern Yemen and all of that, those folks are darker than your Syrians. You know, and remember this area also had Hittites, which are Indo-European speakers who settled into these areas as well. Right. So the text continues. This finding is in agreement with morphological data that suggests that populations with sub-Saharan morphological elements were present in northeastern Africa. So when you say sub-Saharan African, that it makes no sense when you're trying to use that as a euphemism for black, because these same quote unquote sub-Saharan Africans were living in Northeast Africa. So sub-Saharan Africans are Northeast Africans. From the Paleolithic to at least the early Holocene and diffused northward to the Levant and Anatolia beginning in the Mesolithic. Indeed, the rare and incomplete Paleolithic to early Neolithic skeletal specimens found in Egypt, such as the 33,000-year-old Nazlet Katur specimen, the Wadi Kubania skeleton from the late Paleolithic site in the Upper Nile Valley, the Karunian, that means the Fayum early Neolithic crania, and the Napta specimen from the Neolithic Napta playa site in the western desert of Egypt show, with regard to great African biological diversity, similarities with some of the sub-Saharan middle Paleolithic and modern sub-Saharan specimens. This affinity pattern between ancient Egyptians and sub-Saharan Africans or sub-Saharans has also been noted by several other investigators and has been recently reinforced by the study of Brace et al., which clearly shows that the cranial morphology of prehistoric and recent Northeast African populations is linked to sub-Saharan populations, therefore Niger-Congo populations. These results support the hypothesis that some of the Paleolithic early Holocene populations from Northeast Africa were probably descendants of sub-Saharan ancestral populations, which would reaffirm the study going for the HLA alleles or genes, which make up the early Macedonians before the Indo-European Greeks came and dominated that area. See, everybody wants to talk about this alleged back migration coming out of the Middle East into Africa. And this whole time, sub-Saharan Africans are migrating in different dispersal periods or events into the Levant, in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So now we're going to deal with this concept of race in a more meaningful context. So to understand the nature of race, you got to understand how the word is developed and used. And so this is coming from the online etymological dictionary. And it, you know, in the modern times, is people descended from a common ancestor, a class of persons allied by a common ancestry. From French, raci, earlier raza. Matter of fact, those old school hip hop heads know the song coming out of the West Coast. This is for La Raza from Kid Frost, right? This is what this is for La Raza, the race, right? Raza, race, breed, lineage, family, possibly from Italian raza, which is of unknown origin, right? Etymologists say it has no connection with Latin radix, meaning root, blah, 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 blah. Klein suggests the words derive from Arabic ras, meaning head, beginning, origin, which would make sense, you know, it coming from Spain as a result of the Arabic Moors taking over Spain for several hundred years, right? And so it would be cognate with Hebrew ra'osh, meaning head, beginning. But it's just used as a category. Like even like when you say the word chapter comes from the word head. And so it's used to group. That the word for head is used to group things. You know, it's superficial groupings. That's essentially, so from there you get the idea of breed, lineage, family, whatever characteristics that you can use to group a group of people, then those characteristics make up their race. It has no real biological truth to it, you know, in terms of like relating it to species and in terms of a human context. But as we can see from this this other example given here by the online etymological dictionary. So it says original senses of the word race in English include wines with characteristic flavor. So for those of you who are wine tasters, if there's a particular, like if there's a sweet taste, that sweet taste, or those wines that have a sweet taste, would be a race of wines. If there was some kind of bitter taste or whatnot, that would be a different race of wines, right? So the second sense, a group of people with common occupation. So there's a race of welders, there's a race of police officers, there's a race of farmers, there's a race of weavers, right? Your occupation becomes the category for grouping, or the characteristic for grouping a particular people. So each one of those are a race. And then even a generation. So I'm Gen X. So I belong to the race of Gen X. There's another race of individuals called the millennials. Then there's another race of individuals called Gen Z. So each generation, there's a boomer generation, that's a different race. So if you understand now the wide range of what a race is, you can see why the way that many of people in the modern times are applying it is just absolutely wrong. And they messed up when they tried to assume that there's certain intellectual capabilities based upon these superficial groupings. Right? So this is an example here. These are clips from a newspaper from 1899, the Los Angeles Herald, number 42, from November 11th, again, 1899. So it talks about the Boers as a race of giants. So it said, aside from the Patagonians, the Boers are probably the tallest race of men in the full grown, and they are stalwart besides men of strength with no useless flesh. It would be difficult to, and anywhere, an entire race of such physical giants as the Boers of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The roving existence, the life in the open air, and the freedom from disturbing cares have combined to make the Boers a race that is almost physically perfect. Right? This is of course language that would be used in this time period. But you see how it's not about their skin color. They're a particular race because they have enough in the population of people that are quote unquote tall, I guess, in comparison to the author and his group of people, right? So the Boers are considered tall, so they're a race of tall people. So now, if that was the case, that means the Dinka, the Nuer, all these Southern Sudanese folks, these will be totally different races because they're super tall. The Batwa would be another different race because they are very short. But these are all relative, and it depends on your perspective, right? And this becomes important when we're talking about the race of the ancient Egyptians. And so when the Europeans came across them, they called them black because in comparison to them, their skin was very dark. But this blackness is a range of color. And the author here, Kyrillos Iskandar, he's only concentrating on one tone of blackness, which we'll see in a moment. So we have individuals like Zahi Hawass, who in an interview titled "Were Ancient Egyptians Black?" from Arise News report, he states, telling who's a sister, who's doing the interview of Zahi Hawass, they, talking about the ancient Egyptians, were dark-skinned, but they were not Negro. Because look at the lips of those Negroes, like that. He starts pointing to his lips. And the nose, he starts pointing to, is like this. It's not real. You cannot connect the Egyptian civilization with the African at all. It's different. So this makes no sense because, regardless, ancient Egypt or Egypt is in Africa. So how can you say you can't connect it with Africa when it lives in Africa? That's like saying that you can't connect Brooklyn to New York City. It has nothing to do with New York City, yet Brooklyn is in New York City. Right? So when you're actually looking at the artifacts, again, these characteristics which he just labeled here, you see, like, this is a deity that's found in the Brooklyn Museum, a statuette of a male deity. Even their gods have the wide nose that he's appearing to. He didn't mention the hair, but you can see the afro hair here and the thick lips. So this is 2625 to 2500 BCE. Right? This is Old Kingdom. Old Middle Kingdom. All right. And what did I say? Yeah, Brooklyn Museum. So then you see statuettes or figurines like this with the same lips. This is from the Middle Kingdom. This one's in the Museum of Fine Arts. All right. You see the statue of the Jeteti in the Middle Age, in his middle age. What do you see in terms of the unique characteristics? And so he'll admit that they are dark-skinned folks, but they are not Negroes. That's his quote. So as you can see, as Christopher Arid said so eloquently, by anybody's definition of what a Black African is, the ancient Egyptians were that. And this is what you see in the representations of themselves. So the matrix culture that created Pharaonic Egyptian, that gave it its language, its values, its ways of expressing art, its technology, and all of that, derived from a group of individuals who look like this. And this is consistent throughout its entire history. Even though you would have individuals who are of Asiatic ancestry who also rose to prominence and had themselves depicted, but in Egyptian motifs, right? So remember that text that I mentioned earlier about Dr. Sally Ann Ashton, the Egyptologist out of Europe. And so she wrote a text, Roman Egyptomania. And so we saw one image from that text earlier, which was this one, figure of the Nubian. And so we can see, that there's no difference in terms of the Egyptian characteristics of these statues here and of a quote unquote Nubian with the same thick lips and a stub nose and all this other kind of stuff. And so this is a Roman depiction going to the 4th century AD. So in the 300s, right? And as Dr. Ashton states, many ancient Egyptians would today be described as Black. But Egyptian art and its rigid canon showed subjects of the king in a stylized manner, often reflecting the facial features found on his own statues. Thus, we only really have these caricatures on which to base our knowledge of the presentation of this group of Egyptians, right? It says the exceptions are the Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty, and it goes on and on. This is from page 128. You could read the rest on your own. You could pause the video, right? But even she has to admit. So you notice I'm not using any Black African scholars, but they're all saying the same thing. The ancient Egyptians are Black. Even if they'll say like in the majority or whatnot, this is the core of the people. They had a phenotype, a set of phenotypes. Even the Romans, when they were depicting the ancient Egyptians, they were dark skinned, but they were not Negro, which makes no sense because negro is the Spanish word for black and dark. And so these Romans, from where the Latin, where the word negro comes from, they would have called them negro because that's their word for black. As a matter of fact, they painted them as such. And you can see this later on in terms of mixed heritage here. This is a quote unquote Nubian with curly hair. And sometimes I believe that they mislabel these because this is definitely of an Egyptian, and this is a late creation. So it was possibly made in Turkey, but this was the 2nd century BCE, a Roman head, right? And so now we get on this, were the ancient Egyptians olive skin? Because they keep saying that the ancient Egyptians were olive skinned. So this is a representation of a so-called modern ancient Egyptian, which is clearly someone of like Greek, Syrian, Turkish admixture at best, but definitely a foreigner, because the ancient Egyptians, regardless, never depicted themselves like this, right? But they always make that statement that the ancient Egyptians were olive colored, but no one ever shows them side by side next to olives. These are the color of olives. They're all dark. Even the lightest of them is 3 or 4 shades darker than the people trying to make the argument that they are in fact olive skin color. What olives are you talking about, right? They show these random representations but never put them next to olives. Because if you were to put them next to, the people that live there that y'all are misidentifying as quote unquote Nubians, these are descendants of ancient Egyptian folks who still live in Egypt. They are olives colored, but how come they never mention this olive? How come they never show what actual olives look like, and then match themselves next to the color of olives? What is an olive? What is this color here? Right? This is olive skinned. But this is our author here, and while he is on a more tan side because he is a tour guide, so he gets a little darker in the sun, but his skin is of the pinkish red, just like his ancestors who come out of Asia. And the Egyptians depicted depicted the Asians with their accurate skin color. So you see a reddish, but it's more of a reddish pinkish to a light pinkish to a straight, yellowish color that you see Palestinians, Syrians, people from the Middle East. That's what their color, their phenotype is. You can tell by the hair. You can tell by the nature of their beards and how they grow. They grow in the exact same way that his does. And matter of fact, as I've mentioned before, his last name Iskandar is Turkish. It is the Turkish way for how you say Alexander, from Alexander the Great. He has a Turkish last name, and he's trying to argue for what that the original ancient Egyptians mirror his look versus what we actually see on the artifacts, as if our eyes no longer work. But when you put his skin color, see when we put the actual olives next to the dark skinned folks who live there, they're a match. But when we put your face next to them, it doesn't match. But it does match those Asiatics, like you was trying to claim for the original ancient Egyptians and the Syro-Palestinians, in terms of their skin color. That's what you tried to argue. No, you match those folks. The ancient Egyptians don't, and they never depicted themselves as such. So when they depicted the foreigners, like this is from the Dynasty 20 of Ramesses III reign, of an Asiatic captive, but it looks just like those Bedouin folks, right, from that area. There's a slight darker pigmentation in contrast to like a Greek, but this in no way is dark enough to be associated with the ancient Egyptians and how they, in the majority, depicted themselves. Not even the hairstyle, not even the forms of beard, none of that, but it all fits the Asiatics that the ancient Egyptians have displayed. So here's some Syrian Amorite women in terms of, you know, how they look. Their skin color is kind of close to this, right? You can see their hairstyle, even though it's kind of adopted a certain ancient Egyptian characteristic. We'll see, but you see the colorful textiles and weaves because that's what they created, right? You can see the color of these Amorites. Some try to claim from the Beni Hassan 12th dynasty temple that these are Israelites, but let's just say that they are. These are not the color of the Egyptians themselves. This is this color here, right? This is how they depict the Asiatic foreigner. They're darker than most Europeans, but they're too light to be considered, you know, the black African, which characterizes the ancient Egyptians, right? So when you look at, you know, King Tut putting his foot on the Asiatic enemies, it looks exactly like our author, right? But when the Egyptians are depicting themselves, look how much darker they are. And their phenotype and their characteristic, it does not mirror these folks. It does not mirror them. The Egyptian women do not look like these women, right? The Remech. This is from the 18th dynasty. This is currently in the Brooklyn Museum, right? So we have this person here, Egyptologist 7, who makes all kind of slanderous videos about any black person who speaks about ancient Egypt. And this is her face and this is her skin color. Nowhere near how the ancient Egyptians depicted themselves. Put her face next to the olives. She's the exact equivalent of this woman right here. Put it next to the olives. They were olive skinned. But you put them next to the people who were actually olive skinned and intermediate, and she has no close characteristics. This is what she thinks she looks like. It's a shame, right? Just another, and I wanted to point this out too, because notice that the men and the women are the same color, right? And so again, our author wants us to believe that when we're talking about, you know, the ancient Egyptians being black, that we're only talking about one extreme phenotype. And so in the book, he uses this image here to talk about when, you know, the blackness, the ancient Egyptians weren't this black. And I can agree, this is a totally different ethnic group. But these people over time also lived in Egypt and were ancient Egyptians in the same way that the Asiatics who settled into Egypt became ancient Egyptian citizens and part of the Egyptians. So these folks, if they're captured and they have children, they're Egyptians. And so this is one group. This is Taharko. Some people say Taharka, but speaking to the people from that region, they say Taharko. And you can clearly see, based upon his scar marks, that he was of a Nuer man of Sudan, so-called Cushites, right? But this is one representation. So when Arthur's saying that they're not black, he's trying to argue that they're not this black, but not understanding that this extreme darkness is only one level of blackness that we speak of. He doesn't count these. So this is a sub-Saharan, reddish, brownish, the same color as the ancient Egyptians. This is a Fulani, same color as the ancient Egyptians of the original Ramech. And I want to believe this is a Berber woman, right? So both of these skin types, these are equally African, equally sub-Saharan. And this is what you see depicted in terms of the representation of ancient Egyptians between these extremes. Right? And so you always have to be armed with the primary source material and be careful in your wording, because they throw this word Nubian around as if everybody was a quote unquote Nubian. There was dozens of different ethnic groups, and many of them had different phenotypes in Sudan, in Egypt, and they're all Black African people by modern standards, right? So this group of African folks on this top register of this, which comes from this is a so-called Nubian tribute to Amenhotep in between 1332 and 1323 BCE, right? Luxor, Egypt. So it's in a tomb. So this group of so-called Nubians or Africans to the south of Egypt are different than these same, which lives in the same area. Two different groups. That's like saying the Akan are the same as the Yoruba, are the same, as the Amazulu, is the same as the Afar, is the same as the Fulani, is the same as the Wolof speakers. These are different groups that have distinguishing dress, distinguishing hairstyles, and the like. We're going to have a different conversation on how, even in Egyptological literature, how the hairstyles are used as identifiers of particular people. And so here's an Egyptian right here in the center. So his skin color is just slightly, matter of fact, it's the same as this Nubian over here and this Nubian right here. These, are still reddish brown, but a darker reddish brown over here, to this being that super rich dark color that we saw again. It's a variety of skin types coming out of that region. And then here are some Egyptians that are following here, again with some other folks, either Egyptians or Nubians. I need to read the text right here. But you can see here the skin color ranges. So if these are Nubians who are the exact same color as the Egyptians, which are right here. Right. And so slightly darker in the representation, this is from the land of Punt. These are Puntites. So if you see any light-skinned Eritreans talking about they were the Puntites, nope. The Egyptians, these were dark-skinned folks in the land of Punt. Those light-skinned Eritrean Asiatics and all of them are recent developments as a result of people coming from Arabia and intermingling with them and introducing Semitic languages to them. Right. So now we address are the women colored yellow. So as you can see in these representations, so these are mainly males here, but in the others, I've shown that the men and women are the exact same color. So when he's talking about that pale color, so there are some representations, for example, where you will see the woman in a kind of yellowish color, right? So this is an Egyptian painting, a sculpture provided fascinating images of life for all classes of people. Da 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 da. Who is this? Because this is the same person twice in this representation. So I didn't put the other part of the note here. But this one is dating back to the 25th or 24th century BCE. So it's Merit Titus and her son Shano. So we see that the son, the male, is that same color as well. But notice, you know, this person actually may be a foreigner because of the hair, right? But we see the same here for the male who is the darkest, provided the darkest red color, and the woman who is provided, you know, this kind of lighter skin color. The son with the standard reddish brown color here, and this is the statue of Nikara and his family, right? And we have this representation, just like how we see with the little boy here who is yellow. We see this Amenhotep I, who is depicted in the yellow skin. He, just like in that other image, he's depicted here twice. So this is Amenhotep I, you know, with a particular crown, and then this particular hairstyle. And then this is his mother, Mose Nefertari. And this is from the Theban tomb too. So you see that the man and the woman is also depicted in that yellowish color. But we know it's symbolic because the same individuals are also depicted in the deep darkish red color. So if we have Kyrillos Iskandar listening right now, which color is she? Is she yellowish or is she dark brownish like her son here? And given which color dominates the most for both male and female, which one is their real color? Do we find whole scenes with 10 or more people in this color? We do not. And so this is their real color, this reddish brown color, Desharet, right? And you can clearly see her African features in here. Advise y'all to, that's why I'm putting the details of many of these images here so you can go look them up yourself at the museum sources where I've taken them. So most of these I've taken from the museum's pages. So nobody can say I'm photoshopping and darkening or doing anything to the images, right? This is what you get. This is what they have on their websites, right? So you can just type in those details and it should come up. But we can see here that the same almost Nefertari over here is blue. So is she yellow or is she darkish red or is she blue? But this is also the same woman who was over here, and she is the pitch black dark color. So is she pitch black dark color? Is she blue? Is she yellow or is she dark red? Which one is it? Which one is more likely her actual color? And, you know, for the umpteenth time, for those of you who are African-centered, the image on the right does not depict her in terms of a deep, rich, black African color in terms of her skin color. It's not a representation of her skin color. This has a symbolic meaning, just like the blue has a symbolic meaning. And the yellow has a symbolic meaning. She cannot simultaneously in her life be blue and this color blue. This is a bright blue. This isn't like a dark blue, like what we would call blue black. This is a light blue. This is dark paint. This is pitch black paint to be exact. This is reddish brown, and this is yellow. She can't be all of them in her lifetime. Otherwise, she'd be sick, dead, or she's an alien. And then we have the same woman depicted pitch black here, blue here. So this is the same image. So this image that you're seeing right here is the same image, you know, because when you look closer, you can see the same missing paint on the face. So this is her blue color right here, and then this is her in a reddish color right here. And so this is even a brighter reddish color than what is depicted here. And we understand that paint varies, right? But there's a point being made here that if you was to argue that this is her color, you'd be lying. Because you have to make a choice, which one and why. Why would they continuously depict themselves in this color if they were this color? The only argument would be that they were appropriating the matrix culture and the skin color of the people who created the matrix culture. If you want to argue that this person is of, Asiatic descent, they still conformed to the skin color of the matrix people, which is a dark brownish red, right? And this is another statuette. So for all those, and I'm arguing against so-called Afrocentric scholars who aren't serious, who keep arguing that this is her skin color. This is her in death. This has a representation in death, right? And she's deified at this point, right? But all of these representations, they never show you all of these representations of her and try to make an argument either for the pitch black or the yellow. And this is alleged to be her mummy. So unfortunately, they won't let us do a skin test on it, the Sheikh Auntie Joke skin test. But but the point here being that when the Egyptians depicted themselves, the vast majority of times, whether this is in paintings or in wood carvings, and if they wanted to make themselves light skinned like the Amorite women and all that, they could have done so. They had the paint, as you can see, these white and pale white colors, the color of the bread. They could have colored themselves that, but they didn't. They colored themselves in the fashion that you see in across Africa of the dark reddish brown color. And notice that the men are the same color as the women. The same here. This is a wood carving set of nothing but women, all dark-skinned black women. Even with the color fading on this one, you can tell, like you can still see the rich, dark, reddish brown skin here. So that's why I keep challenging y'all. Show me these artifacts where it's a whole bunch of them in a group, because we're dealing with populations, not individuals. They can only show you an individual image or a statue or painting of a single person, but they can never show you a population. They never show you populations of people, right? And remember that documentary that Zahi Hawass, where we made that quote from Zahi Hawass? This was the documentary where the ancient Egyptians black, and this was the host. And what's ironic is that Iskandar was making the argument that the women were the pale cream color, which is supposed to be the default real color of the ancient Egyptians. But in the same book, matter of fact, let me get the page number. This is somewhere in the back of the book. So if you go to page 69 of the book, you'll see this image of Queen Hatshepsut. But in his book, he has the side profile of Queen Hatshepsut, who's painted in the dark reddish brown paint, right? And notice that the host of the documentary looks exactly like the bust of Queen Hatshepsut, down to the same color. Matter of fact, she may be a little lighter. I'm talking about the host right here. She may be a little lighter than this paint, but these are the exact same color. They have the exact same nose. They have the exact same lips. This is what Hatshepsut would have looked like, right? These are notice that in this top right corner, the king and his wife, same dark skin color. And these quote unquote Nubians here, remember the Nubian hairstyle that Queen Nefertiti was wearing? This is the hairstyle that came up in the video right here in this right-hand corner. Notice the man and the woman, the same colors. African hairstyles, African features, nose, lips, skin color, everything, right? In this photo from the Dynasty 18, statue of two men and a boy, dark skin. And I don't know why it says two men. This looks like a woman, but it's possible two men because the holding hands here, and that's a feature in Northeast Africa and even in the Middle East. Men, matter of fact, in certain parts of West Africa, they do this as well. Men, and it's a sign of friendship, hold a hand. But we crazy here in the United States. We would look at this as something else. But we can see here in this photo from the papyrus of Nakhet, the Book of the Dead, which is a scribe from the 19th dynasty. The man and the woman are the same color. Even Ma'at is this dark brown skin here. Because Osiris is green. Just different variations of Nakhet that you can see from the papyrus. Right. This is a Black African person, just like these ladies that we saw earlier in that scene, just kind of a close-up, right? This man and woman from the Chapel of Maya in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, New Kingdom. What? Dark-skinned man, dark-skinned woman, white, not pale. That is usually seen, like when you see the pale women, the dominant representation or place of the representation is in funerary reliefs. Again, typical, East African woman look in brothers here. These are folks currently living in, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Eastern Uganda, Sudan, Eastern Sudan, and the like. Right? We see this couple here with the same. These are two different people. These are two different couples here, but both of them are the same color in terms of the male and female. Right? This is the same couple. This first image was encompassed in the glass, so I had to find a non-glass couple. But you can see that the man and the woman are the exact same dark skin, brown, African black color. Same thing you see with these images. Man, dark skin, black, reddish brown, black color. And the man and the woman in these different images. This one, the paint is coming off of the face, but you can still see it on the body. And the woman is the same color. Same over here, same color. Right? And actually, these are the same image. I'm sorry. This is the same image as this one. This one, different angles, but because of the peeling on from the front of you can see better from the side view here. And actually, hold on, let me double check. This may yeah, the same image. Just make sure. So we see here the richness of the Magi warriors, and then we have a whole wooden thing of three women, carrying a thing on their head, a classic, typical African thing, the way they hold, items on their head and walk. But you can see that these are women, and they're all dark brown Black African people. Same thing here. It's a brother here, dark skinned brown African, dark skinned brown African, dark skinned brown African. Like we could do this all day. Dark skinned brown African. Because this brother's dark skinned brown with the reddish brown skin color with the typical African afro. The sister here, she may be depicted in that kind of yellowish color, but we can see by her braids, she's wearing an African braids hairstyle. These are, unmistakably dark skin. These are three different images: dark skin, Black African woman, dark skin, Black African man, dark skin, Black African woman. See, that this is the frontal view. That's the same photo we saw here in the center, right? But this is clearly a Black African man, reddish brown skin. And you can see a whole boatload of Black African folks with their afros in the boat carvings. This is in the Egyptian Museum. And I have photos of all of this in video. This is a seated figure from the News Museum in Berlin. It's kind of hard to see, but they were, painted dark skin here, but it's kind of harder to distinguish because, the entire carving is kind of similar in color. But, we continue. We see this brother here, dark skin, brown, reddish, Black African with this afro, and the child. I don't know if it's a boy or girl. Looks like a girl, but it could be a boy. But still, dark skin, brown, reddish. Same here with this woman, dark skin, brown, reddish. This is just straight up dark skin, Black in terms of this scribe here, all with the afro, African hairstyles. Again, we do this to overexhaust because we dare anybody who is in opposition to our arguments to show as many. And I can just do a whole presentation of nothing but hundreds of slides of individual artifacts repeating the same thing. And I don't have to repeat a single slide. But, so we got this stuff for days. But notice, if they wanted to be able to represent them as lighter skinned folks, they would have. They had the capability, they had the paint, but they went out of their way to ensure that the skin color was painted the darkish reddish brown that is typical for this region and all across Africa, and with their Black African features. Right? Now we get into certain parts of the characteristics, like the cream cones that's on top of the heads. You can only do that on Black African hair. You can't do this on white people hair and in people from the Middle East. You can't get these hairstyles like this with the kind of hair that you got in the Middle East. That's not how they do it. These are typical African hairstyles, as we can see. They're very distinguishable. This is the matrix culture, right? This is from a barbering scene from the tomb of Userhat, right? And you can see that to this date that these Beja and Afar people are still using these same techniques to this date, creating the same hairstyles that are depicted in the ancient Egyptian reliefs. Same folks doing the cattle raising in ancient Egypt. They're now, in Egypt still doing it in the southern parts. So they migrated to the Sudan and other places. Right? When you talk about these Medja warriors and the Beja people, you can tell by their hairstyles. They have a unique way of doing their fro in the way that they cut them. These are the same folks. And so while these are different groups, I put these here side by side because of the body style, body type. So even in the ancient Egyptian reliefs, you are seeing the tropical adapted body proportions and the slender Nilotic body type being depicted as the standard for the canon of ancient Egyptian males and females, right? This is the actual skull of Tutankhamun and his unique head shape. It's unique for people who live in the Middle East and Europe, but it's not unique in places like Uganda and Ethiopia, where this is the common head shape. So you can probably tell where his lineage comes from because of this head shape. And the same thing with his sisters and Akhenaten's. Even though Akhenaten is not the father of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, has this same head shape in the depiction of himself in the reliefs, and so does his daughter and Queen Nefertiti, right? Which tell you that they come from a group. These are characteristics from a group of people in that stretch from ancient Egypt to modern Ethiopia in the Omo Valley, right? When we're looking at the actual depictions of the ancient Egyptians and their skin color and their hair types, it matches perfectly. This is what the dark reddish brown skin looks like. It don't look like Kyrillos Iskandar and Egyptologist 7. This is how the Egyptians were depicting themselves, wearing their natural African hair with their natural African hairstyles. And why, when foreigners came into Egypt, they tried to emulate these hairstyles because these were associated with royalty, with actual people in human groups. The native folks don't have to wear wigs. They just style their hair in a way using the characteristics and the properties from which their hair naturally grows. Right? That's why this hairstyle, they keep saying it's a wig. And first of all, you haven't even seen a wig, an Egyptian wig like this. This is the hairstyle. Now keep in mind, these are stone monuments and paintings. So it's all paint. It's a stone carving that represents real life. And so this is real life over here on the right. With the lips like this and the nose like this. Right? These African people do not have to, it can't be argued for a wig for these hairstyles. This is their natural hair, right? So when you do look at the wigs of ancient Egypt, they're styled after real African groups and African people. These are Beja. So when you see this wig and this style, they're imitating the Beja people, right? When you see these actual wigs, these are actual Afro hairstyle. Like, how do you go to the museum and it's an actual Afro, big Afro like this? You don't see wigs like this in Europe. You don't see wigs like this and hairstyles like this in the Middle East, right? And remember, I told you about the body type and the body proportions. These are tall, slender folks in some of these representations. This is a sister here. Matter of fact, this is a modern hairstyle. This looks like some sisters from the 90s. This kind of look like Jada Pinkett hairstyle in the 90s, right? This is from the 8th dynasty, Old Kingdom, a figure of a woman. Right, so this is, I think, the same woman or a variant of that same kind of style. So you can see the African hairstyle, the African lips and nose. And in this representation here, almost look like she got Bantu knots at the top. So this one's also an Old Kingdom, right? So you see this brother with his lips and nose and his Afro type hair. Like, this is a unique style here. They're doing something real crazy. This is Dynasty 6, this Old Kingdom. See, they never show you these statues and photos when they want to make an argument for an in Asiatic ancient Egypt. And, you know, so that ends my slideshow there. So I do appreciate each and every one of you for joining this conversation. I didn't want to make it too long. It's already past the 2-hour mark in which I promised. But if you have any questions, please leave it in the comment section, as well as if you just have a comment. Make sure that you like and subscribe the video, and that you share it with your friends, and especially the people who's hating on Black Egypt. Make sure you share it with them as well. But we will continue our critique of the text, Ancient Egyptians Refute Afrocentrism, by Kyrillos Iskandar, the Turkish Egyptian citizen who wrote this Facebook reply, this Facebook page reply, and turn it into a book. So that's that. So until next time, peace.
That's on my mind, and I would like to let them out. Look, I see reality breaking down all my fantasies. It would be nice if I at least had one fantasy. That neutrality about to take a terabyte from the American apple pie, better get a slice. It's kinda scary the way that this life is moving on. Marvin's doing backflips inside his grave, what's going on? We have head-on collisions, not seeing another's vision. Maybe that's the reason why some colors fit the description. A lot of relationships need life rafts, sinking ships. I guess you just can't have only one like potato chips. I would love for you to listen with an open heart, but would you really even hear me if it's torn apart? I don't do the things that I used to. I'll be fine even if I lose you, okay? Yeah.
This program was created with the love and support of all our Patreon members and subscribers. If you are not a member yet and would like to see more content like this, consider becoming a member today. The link is in the description of this video. Your support is greatly appreciated.